So good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Velandia, and welcome to a new episode of Voices of History, a new segment in which we give the floor to national and international experts to delve into the key moments of our history. Today, we embark on a fascinating episode of military history. We will travel back to November 1943 to the heart of the Pacific, where the United States launched Operation Galvanic, the landing of the Marines on the island of Tarawa, a short, brutal, and decisive battle that showed the world that amphibious warfare would look like in the future. So, to guide us on this journey, we are honored to have a special guest. And now I would like to begin by introducing the organizer of this segment, David De Caizal. He's a military historian, director of the Security and Defense area of INISEC, and director of the research group on the International Center for Advanced Research in Security and Defense of INISEC, and member in support of the Association of the United States Army, advisory member of the Military Law on Security section of the Madrid Bar Association, and member of the INISEC Research Group, and the University and Agency Partnership Program, a university project for the dissemination of the U.S. defense culture, member of the Association of the Historian of Catalonia. So, David, welcome, and you have the floor. Te cedo la palabra, David, para poder iniciar con esa primera presentación.
Muchas gracias, Laura, por esta presentación. Después de este parón del verano, por las vacaciones, iniciamos de nuevo esta presentación de Voces de la Historia Militar con nuestro estimado amigo el Coronel Philippe D, con una estupenda presentación sobre la Operación Galvanic, la operación de los marines en el desembarco de Tarawa. Hay que decir muy rápidamente una breve introducción histórica, antes de dar paso a nuestro ponente, que la Operación Galvanic fue el nombre clave, como bien conocemos, de la ofensiva estadounidense para conquistar el atolón de Tarawa en las Islas Gilbert durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Su momento clave fue el desembarco de los marines en Betio, en la isla principal del atolón, que entre el 20 y el 23 de noviembre del 43 se llevó a cabo dicho desembarco. En el contexto estratégico, para hacernos una idea general, el objetivo era capturar Tarawa como base avanzada a esas futuras operaciones anfibias en las Islas Marshall y abrir el camino hacia las Marianas y las Filipinas, el salto de isla en isla, que era el proyecto de la estrategia norteamericana en el Pacífico, hasta recuperar las Filipinas. Como fuerzas implicadas tenemos a la Segunda División de Marines, apoyada por la Flota del Pacífico, más de 17 portaaviones, acorazados, destructores y buques anfibios. Japón aproximadamente tenía en la isla unos 4.800 defensores, incluidos 2.600 marinos de élite y trabajadores coreanos forzados. En las defensas japonesas nos encontramos en Betio, que estaba fuertemente fortificada, con búnkeres de hormigón, cañones costeros, nidos de ametralladora, obstáculos en la playa, con una gran red de defensa japonesa para evitar el desembarco de las tropas de los marines. El desarrollo de la operación tenemos un bombardeo previo, 19-20 de noviembre, donde la flota estadounidense bombardeó Betio y realizó ataques aéreos. Sin embargo, muchas fortificaciones japonesas permanecieron operativas e intactas a ese ataque. El desembarco inicial, el 20 de noviembre, los marines se enfrentaron a una marea baja bastante inesperada, lo que les dejó varadas las lanchas de desembarco en el arrecife. Muchos tuvieron que vadear cientos de metros con fuego intenso para alcanzar la playa con ese fuego intenso de las ametralladoras y los morteros japoneses. Tuvieron altas bajas en las primeras horas, debido también al fuego cruzado japonés. En el avance tierra adentro, el 21-22 de noviembre, los marines, usando tanques ligeros, lanzallamas, granadas, fueron reduciendo poco a poco las posiciones defensivas japonesas. En el combate, que fue extremadamente sangriento, en un espacio reducido, pensemos que solo medía 3,2 kilómetros de largo. En la consolidación, el 23 de noviembre, 3 días importantes de lucha, Tarawa quedó bajo control norteamericano y solo unos pocos defensores japoneses sobrevivieron a la defensa. El resultado y las consecuencias, en cuanto a bajas estadounidenses, cerca de 1.000 muertos, 2.100 heridos, bajas japonesas, más del 97% de los defensores japoneses murieron en la isla, tan solo apenas 17 fueron capturados por los marines. En las lecciones aprendidas, una importante necesidad de mejorar la coordinación del bombardeo naval y el desembarco, que eso evidentemente mejoraría en las próximas acciones ofensivas y de desembarcos anfibios por parte de los marines en el Pacífico, la importancia de los vehículos anfibios, los LVT, para superar los arrecifes y los obstáculos realizados por los japoneses, y el impacto psicológico, el alto coste en vidas que conmocionó evidentemente a la opinión pública norteamericana y que demostró la capacidad de los marines, sobre todo, para tomar posiciones fortificadas por parte de los japoneses. Y como importancia estratégica, pues el primer gran asalto anfibio estadounidense en el Pacífico Central, que abriría el camino para campañas posteriores en las Marshalls y en las Marianas y, como decíamos antes, hasta la liberación de las Filipinas. Y con ello, pues esta pequeña introducción histórica a la masterclass de Voces de la Historia de hoy. Gracias, Laura.
Thank you very much, David. An excellent presentation of this episode segment on military history. Today we have a special guest to talk about this exciting episode, Coronel Philippe Rogers. He is a veteran and Marine Corps leader with experience in more than 100 combat missions and service in international operations with the UN, NATO, and the US. Recognized of his academic and military career, he combined extensive strategic training with a deep commitment to guiding in support Marines. So let's welcome Coronel. Thank you so much for joining us. And the audience is all yours to begin your presentation.
Hey, thank you very much. Yeah, I just want to make sure you can hear me. Yeah, everything is good?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, David, I know you are always the master with the slides. I'll let you start off with that. And thank you for that. Again, my Spanish is not as up to date as it should be, and I know everybody speaks fast in their normal language. But David, I followed a lot of that, and that was a good precursor and introduction to what I'm going to talk about. And Laura, thank you as always for the introduction, and I appreciate that. So this is maybe fewer slides than what I usually give, only because of the scale of the battle and that it happened over the course of 3 to 4 days, as David alluded to. But this is really, really, really a fundamental battle in Marine Corps. And also, and I misspelled battle, obviously, in the Tarawa. But anyway, on the slide there, sorry for my editing. But I will tell you that this has strategic importance because it really laid the foundation of how we would compare, how the Marine Corps will continue a specific campaign. Now, the battles that we've talked about, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and others are longer and, take weeks, if not months, and sometimes almost, in some cases, over the course of a change of a year to root out all the Japanese defenses. But this was a very short battle, but very important in that it tested the doctrine of the amphibious doctrine, and also the Japanese had altered their tactics as well. And just to let you know how important this is in the Marine Corps history, when I was a second lieutenant going through the basic school at Quantico, Virginia, and I hadn't even graduated from, I'd been commissioned, but I wasn't even graduating from what we call our 6-month basic school, where everybody becomes an infantryman. I had to present a class on the Battle of Tarawa. So that was, of course, before the wars that we've in Iraq and Afghanistan and Beirut and all the other things, well, after Beirut, but that we've done. But this was how important it was. And I remember vividly the lessons learned. I can remember giving the class to my fellow lieutenants about what happened here. So as you look at the agenda, these are the things that we will cover. And I'll give you, as I always do, why it was important, why it's legendary in the Corps as part of the lore of the Corps, where we were in the strategic campaign as far as not only globally, but also the Pacific, and why it was important and why we were doing what we were doing at that particular time. We'll talk about the Japanese, specifically how they changed tactics from Guadalcanal and from other earlier encounters with the Japanese to what they were doing now to defend. We'll talk about the Marines and the Navy. This was pretty much just a Marine battle with Navy support, Navy gunfire support, not as much aviation as we've seen before. We'll talk about the atoll a little bit. David did a good job of letting now that Betio is and is part of Kiribati now. Betio is the principal island of this atoll, although there are several islands that are laid out if you look at a larger map, and we'll take a look at that. And then we'll talk about the battle itself. 4 days. So the scale of this happens very quickly, but the amount of casualties were catastrophic. And the Japanese were surrendered with only a very few, as they were wont to do, because they were such ferocious fighters and did not believe in surrendering. The Marines, because of the tides, because of new tactics, because of vehicles they were using, because of the less than 1 day or two of preparation for the battlefield, really suffered a lot of casualties. And there was, even though it was considered a major win in battle, there was, in the aftermath, a lot of controversy in the United States about the number of killed. So we'll talk about that as well, and then we'll talk a little bit about the lore and the legacy. And like I did on my last one here, when we talked about the Chosen Reservoir, you'll see some books that I'll kind of highlight. There's one right there, 1 Square Mile of Hell, which really, and I've read several of them because it's important to our understanding of the Marine Corps where we are right now. The lower one that you see there is a comic book, but anyway, that is indicative of how important it is to the Marine Corps. You can see a quick black and white picture there of the casualties that are strewn on the beach, very reminiscent of what it looked like at D-Day in a very, very small area. You see a Japanese tank there. They had tanks on the island, and they had guns on the island as well. So did actually the Americans landed a few as well. And then the island that you see right there, not the best map, but it is a triangular shaped, 2 miles long, at the widest part of the island, only 800 yards. So we're talking a very, very short distance, less than half a mile. So all this firepower, all this fighting is going to happen in very, very tight confines. And the Japanese had spent about a year preparing the battlefield for this. And you'll see some quotes later on. Matter of fact, let's go to the next slide. So there are more characters that are involved in this. For the Japanese, unfortunately, it's really just this Rear Admiral Shizbazaki, if I pronounced that correctly. And actually, he died in the first day of battle, along with 40%. I'm sorry, along with all of his senior staff, and 40% of his warriors were killed in that first day of fighting, with the preparation of the naval gunfire, a little bit of aviation firepower, and then the resultant invasion. So the Rear Admiral had been there for about a year. We'll talk a little bit about him later on in some of his quotes. So he dies at age 49. That's obviously a picture when he was at the academy or something like that. But really, he's the only one of note that we're going to talk about from the Japanese perspective. But his actions are indicative of what the Japanese were doing to prepare for other islands. As I mentioned, if you recall my Guadalcanal class, or if you did not, when we stormed ashore, essentially it was unopposed. The Japanese believed in letting the Marines or the Army or the soldiers come ashore and then allow them to come into killing zones and then unleash fire. So one way of looking at it, with this smaller island, probably not much of a choice that he had, but the Rear Admiral decided that he was going to arm this island to the teeth. Again, up until the last day, or up until the day of battle, he was preparing the battlefield and his island for the assault, which he correctly predicted would predominantly be from the north and from the west of the island, because on the other side of the island was deep water, so not the best way to attack. And he was, he decided that he was going to kill as many as he could in the lagoon as they were coming up to the shoreline. General Howland Mads Smith, that's a famous name that most Marines know. He had been in charge of various different campaigns, but he was in charge overall of the division. And then Colonel David Moreau Shoup, who's going to be a key, very, very key figure, which I'll talk about a little bit later on in detail, was in charge of the 6th Marine Regiment, leading them ashore. And he would actually end up winning the Medal of being awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that were very, very important to the swinging the tide of battle, especially with so many casualties happening. And he would later on become the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And actually, just for a coda on that, later on he became very anti-Vietnam War. But he was a lot of Marines will know who Colonel Shoup is if you talk about not only him being a commandant, but his actions there. And there's a great quote that I'll talk about later on. You see me say right there, the important first strategic battle in Pacific theater during World War II. Up until that point, we had rehearsed amphibious operations. We knew of amphibious operations. We had come ashore in an amphibious way. But this is the first time we were going to use what were called Higgins boats. And I don't have a great picture of that on this slide, but these are the drop ramp little boats that you'll see that were developed in the South. Actually, if my memory serves me correctly, in Louisiana, named after a manufacturer that his name was Higgins. And these boats were amphibious and able to drop the ramps. And then just like you see in the D-Day movies, let troops come ashore. They also had landing vehicles, tractors, LVTs, which ended up saving the day and providing a little bit more cover because they were armored, not so much that they couldn't be punched through by heavy weaponry like a heavy machine gun, but they were able to skirt across the lagoon. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the Higgins boats would be very key to other subsequent operations. The LVTs proved to be very, very important here at this particular battle. But essentially, this was the test case of the Marine Corps saying, this is how we're going to do the island hopping campaign. Now, the next slide, I'll talk about it in a second, does have a picture, and we'll discuss a little bit more like David did. But this is the first time the Marine Corps is employing its overall amphibious operational tactics and strategy and how they're going to do things. And they're going to take away a lot of lessons learned from this. So next slide, please. Here's where we'll talk about the strategic context. There are better maps out there that show Tarawa, and I'll point it out in the map here in a second. But this was one I thought that was very good to show you. The big blue arrow on the top is how the Marines are approaching the Pacific island hopping campaign. And the one to the south is more of the Army, although there were some Marines involved with the Army amphibious shipping led by MacArthur. Now, the Marines had taken this particular position. Now, this is, remember, after Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal had happened in August 1942 to February 1943. We are now over into November of 1943. But of course, there's preparation for the 2nd Marine Division after Guadalcanal. It goes to New Zealand to refit, to recoup, to reinforce its forces and replace lost casualties. So now they're back into the fray. But if you look at the bottom right-hand corner where the blue arrow kind of comes across this, the upper blue level come across the red line, you'll see the island of Tarawa. Now, this is, you can see very, very far away, and the distances in the Pacific are astronomical. The maps never do justice as to how far things are. And just to let you know, I still go to conferences today where Marine generals and Army generals and Air Force are talking about the tyranny of distances involved. Yes, we have amphibious vehicles. Yes, we have high-performing aircraft. Yes, we have B-52s, et cetera, but just to provide the logistics across these island chains in modern terms, it is so difficult, and it is always a logistical problem, and you are always open to enemy actions, of course. Here, the Marines in just old freighters and destroyers and battleships and amphibious aircraft, amphibious ships are landing in early islands and then moving on as to the Gilbert Islands is where Tarawa is found and part of the campaign. But then it's going to go to the Marshall Islands, and then later on to the Marianas, then to Iwo Jima, then to Okinawa, so on and so forth. But there's a lot of war happening before that happens. We're looking at another 2 years of fighting plus till we get to the point where we're at Okinawa and we're wrapping that up. So this is the first real kind of hopscotch or first island hopping that we're going to do. And why, nowadays we would just bypass, 3,000 Japanese that are, or whomever the enemy would be reinforcing our island, because we would just know that, okay, we don't need to concern ourselves with that. But back then, we're talking in the early days of, carriers and submarine warfare. And actually the U.S. is still back on its feet along with its allies. The Japanese still have the strategic advantage, although they do know now that there is an existential threat. They've lost Guadalcanal. They know things are going to happen. The Solomon Islands proved to them that, hey, they can't hold out forever. So they're going to reinforce and they're going to fight every single island along the way. And because we only have limited distance for aircraft and refueling and logistical stores, et cetera, returning aircraft that are lame ducks that need to land someplace, whatever the case may be. We have to take these islands. We can't ignore them because they do provide a threat to be attacked from behind or laterally or whatever the case may be. So you can see this is the very, 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 very beginning, and it's just a 3-day battle. But its impact and second and third order effects are going to be very strategic in value. So I think I just talked about that here. Remember, too, that we're looking here in 43 and 43. The Europe is just starting to get his legs as far as coming back to attack the Nazis. So there's a couple of amphibious raids that happened up in Dieppe. The campaign that's happening in North Africa is happening, but we're still a long ways away, almost a year and a half before a D-Day invasion, and we're fighting on the mainland of France and then Germany and of course Italy. So this is early in the campaign too. So a lot of the resources are primarily directed towards Europe to help with the Allies, or the Russians and the at the time, and then also the Brits and the French and what have you. So this is a not an isolated campaign, but it's given to the Marines and the Army to conduct these campaigns. So even though they still resonate and they still make a lot of newsworthy news, I hate to say that, or headlines as far as the successes, is quite not yet what's going to, it's not the focus yet. So what's going to happen on Tarawa is going to be buried a little bit later on, but this is very important is what happens. Okay, next slide, please. The Japanese. Okay, so and I'll talk about this on the next slide too, but the Japanese knew this was coming, and of course they've been ordered. The preparations have been going over for a year. The rear admiral who shows up takes over for somebody else who's actually done a very good job. There's the 3rd Special Base Defense Force and the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, essentially engineers. And they also have Korean and Japanese laborers. So the Imperial Navy is storming the seas and making sure, that giving the Allied forces difficulty along the way, sinking, subs or sinking resupply and what have you. But there are 2,600 some troops that are on this very, very small island. Now, 2 miles sounds like a big distance. And also when you're looking at 800 meters at the widest across, but 2,600 forces can fill a very, very small place very quickly. Plus you have 2,200 construction laborers, that are coming from a forced labor from the Koreans, maybe Japanese as well. There's 14 tanks ashore, 40 artillery pieces that are dug in, and there's some pictures that I'll show a bit later on. And then 14 big 16-inch naval guns from the Russo-Japanese War. So these were back from, and you can see maybe a little picture there, a 16-inch gun is a big piece of weaponry. When we had the Missouri and some of the other big ships that we had, one name is escaping me right now, but those had 16-inch guns on them, and we used to say they were firing essentially like a Volkswagen. It sounded like a freight train when the weaponry was going off, and so the explosive capability of that was unbelievable. So the Japanese had taken those and they had dug in pits, they had put logs in, they had reinforced, they had fields of fire. Of course, they cleared as many trees as they could to make sure that it was very difficult for the advancing forces to come. Now, that upper right-hand picture, they had a gangway or a plank or a pier that they had built all the way out into the lagoon. And I remember this from teaching the class a long time ago. This is how they brought things in to reinforce or to resupply the Japanese. One of the things that the American intelligence had done was estimate by looking at the number of outhouses that they had built on this pier. And I don't know, I didn't find a reference to it this time, but I remember this from my class, so I'll add it in. Hopefully it's not urban legend, but the number of outhouses they had, they were able to figure out the approximate number of Japanese that were on the islands, because a certain amount of troops would need a certain amount of latrines or whatever. So yes, they would do their business in the lagoon. Probably didn't make it safe for anybody, but there's a tide that comes in and out. But that little pier was also important as far as giving an estimate of what was going on. We knew, the Allies knew that this was heavily defended, and they knew that there was going to be a tough fight. But remember, before, up until this point, the Japanese had allowed forces to come ashore and then engage them, not engage them as they were coming from the sea. All right, next slide, please. So the rear admiral here continued, like I said, his preparations up into the day of the invasion. This is a famous quote. He said it would take 1 million years, 1 million men, 100 years to conquer Tarawa. So the Marines are going to do it in 3 or 4 days. Now, I think, was that a little bit of hyperbole? Yes, on his part. But I believe at that time, they really did think that they could exact a toll that would be so difficult that it might stop the invasion, or it might incur a great deal of casualties and make it a Pyrrhic victory, in the sense that, was it worth doing this? Now, some of that is, though, he had, with 2,000, 3,000 people on land and being attacked by a force of 30,000, usually we say in military speak that the military invader needs 3 times the amount of offensive attacking forces to take on, 1/3 of that, or 3 times the number of forces to take over a defending force. So there was certainly that. But you can see, and especially a quote from General Shoup later on, there was a toll that was exacted. I copied and pasted this just because I wanted to make sure everybody understood, not only from the map, but we're talking a long way from from Pearl Harbor. It is the largest island in the Tarawa Atoll. Yes. And then, I talked about the distances as far as it goes. And I put that in kilometers and meters as well, just so people from other have a good idea if you're not working in miles. And then I talked about the pier that was constructed from the North Shore. And then, beyond the 500-meter shallow reef which surrounded the island. So this was, the intent was to attack through this island because they thought the tide was going to be high enough that the Higgins boats could come in and then drop off, but not being too deep enough that, heavily combat-laden troops would drown. It was the northern part of the coast that's pointing up in the map that you see that faced the lagoon, while the southern face, the west and the western sides, faced deep waters of the open ocean. So defended to a certain extent, but that they understood that was probably not going to be the angle of attack. All right, next one, please. Now, as far as the Marines go, again, I talked about the Marine divisions after Guadalcanal. And when we talk about the actions along with the Army and the Solomons, this was, the fighting has stopped essentially in February 1943. They go back to New Zealand to recoup. Reinforcements come, resupplies come. Okay, where is it decided to go next? The Army starts attacking in the little blue arrow that I showed and the upper blue arrow from the other map. So it was the 5th Amphibious Corps. We only have 3 expeditionary forces nowadays. So the Marine Corps had gone up to 500,000 Marines at this particular point. And this is led by the 2nd Marine Division, which still exists to this day on the eastern coast. The U.S. 5th Fleet, which was essentially led by Admiral Spruance, you have 35,000 total troops, 18,000 Marines. And then you can see all the ships and everything that is supporting there. At this particular point, this was the largest invasion force that the U.S. had put together up to this point in the war. Of course, D-Day is going to make this, look at very small in scale, but this was the largest effort for one single objective up until this particular point. And then just a quick show of, what it looks like. And I know that's a painting on the bottom, but couldn't find a great picture, probably because they were under fire at the time. But the Higgins boats would drop the ramp, and then essentially you would come ashore, probably wading through waist deep water, we hope. Hopefully you're not drowning. If you've seen the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, which is the opening scenes are so powerful as to what it's like, all music removed, just, the fear that as you're advancing, as brave as you are, and that ramp goes down, you are just know that you are targeted by someone who's just waiting for that ramp to come down, if they're not already shooting bullets through the thin plates that were armored at the time. Now, the upper picture shows the light vehicles, the landing vehicles tracked that has some weaponry on them, and they were able to come up a little bit closer. Some of them had drop ramps as well, but you can see they came up against the tidal wall there, and you'll see a lot of pictures that are associated with Tarawa that show that, it was just low enough to make it difficult for the Higgins boats to come. It was just high enough to allow the tractors to come in and the tanks, if they didn't drown in the water, or they succumbed to being, falling in the water and then never being able to steam on. But then they would come up, and it wasn't a sloping shoreline in most places. It was reinforced with piers and sandbags, which made it very difficult. And a lot of them just got stuck with their soft underbellies. It was easy to take them out. So we'll talk a little bit more about the battle here in a second, but let's go to the next slide. All right, so one of my pictures disappeared there, but that's okay. You can see on that bottom left-hand picture how the beach, there just was not much cover, and it's not much of a landing zone or beach. Matter of fact, and I'll talk about this in a second, a lot of the forces here, this is with their first amphibious operations for the Marines, under fire. A lot of them are just going to huddle along the beach, and just because there's almost impossible wall of lead that's being directed at them. And so it's going to take a major effort to get beyond that. One of the things that we always talk about in tactics is to keep moving, to keep moving, to keep moving. The propensity for any human under fire, much less in some kind of danger, is to stop, hide, find something to hide behind, whether it's your fellow who's been killed next to you, or a rock, or a dig, or whatever the case may be. But if you will just be subject to more withering fire if somebody doesn't advance. So this is where the difficulty lied on this beach. The map here, again, not the clearest that I lifted off the internet, but there's red beach and green beach. And why we do this is, and there was a black beach on the south, but that was not used. This is just the way of, just like in D-Day, where they talked about Omaha Beach or Utah Beach or whatever the beach, Gold Beach, whatever the other beaches were. In Marine Corps speak, we talk about red beaches and green beaches, blue beaches, whatever the case may be. And these are assigned to different infantry units, different attacking forces, artillery, whatever the case may be. So the initial effort comes through in the north, through the lagoon, for the red beaches, and they're labeled 1, 2, and 3. I'm not going to get into those specifics, but that's where they come from. And then afterwards, the green beaches are going to be attacked from the western part to continue the battle and kind of clean up from the way. Now, just so you know, to this day at Camp Pendleton and some of the other beaches that we use for training, we still call them red beach and green beach. And there's a lot of Marines that don't understand where that history comes from, that etymology, but that's where it originates from. We do that to honor the beaches that we had taken before in different battles. Okay, next slide, please. All right, first day of battle. Now, again, this happens very quickly, as David said, from the 20th of November, from the initial assault till really the 23rd, but by the 23rd, it's wrapping up operations. But as I mentioned, this American invasion force was the largest yet assembled for a single operation in the Pacific. Just to tell you the toll right up front, by the end of the first day, 5,000 Marines have been put ashore, 1,500 are casualties, either dead or wounded. That is close to a 30% casualty rate, which is unsustainable in large-scale operations. Now, some of this was, again, and you can see the little painting there, which does, it doesn't give you the veracity of what's happening here, but you can see how Marines would be coming off the Higgins boats into the water. And this is a very idealistic picture. Imagine explosions happening, bullets ripping through. Unfortunately, like a lot of these vehicles, like I talked about, got stuck in some cases over 500 meters out in the lagoon. So Marines are stumbling off these things because they're trapped. They can't move forward. The ships are stuck. Yes, there's some gunners up on they're actually run by the Coast Guard at the time, and some Navy personnel who end up actually getting awarded a lot of medals in the war because they were the drivers of the ships. Nowadays, it's Marines, but they are falling into the water, if not drowning immediately. They're stumbling through, rifles raised over their heads, trying to move forward. And you can just imagine the firepower that's coming at them from all kinds of caliber weapons. Big guns, artillery, Navy, the big 14-inch, 16-inch guns that you saw. I think they're 14-inch guns. I said 16-inch earlier. The Japanese machine guns, not to mention mines and anything else that was thrown out there. So this is what this is what a lot of the casualties end up being. The upper picture that you see, the black and white, I was trying to give you an idea. I didn't have a good picture of the scale, but you're advancing essentially through this open killing zone in the water with no protection, all the way up to the beach line, while again there's log pits, sniper pits, spider holes, whatever the case may be, of the Japanese just raining down fire on you. And just like any well-prepared force, they have clear angles of fire. They know where they're going, who they're going to shoot upon. So this is just murderous, and this is where we lose a lot of people. Colonel Shoup, who stormed aboard the first day and took command of all troops who were on the first wave of assaults. Again, he's a colonel who's in charge of the regiment, is wounded almost right away. I think he takes a bullet to his right forearm. I think he gets nicked in the neck, but he storms ashore. And not to foretell things, he said, this is one of his great quotes, and I'll talk about another one here. There was never a doubt in the minds of those ashore what the final outcome of the Battle of Tarawa would be. There were some 76 hours, however, considerable haggling with the enemy over the exact price we would have to pay. This was, and once you start, you can't go back. This was murderous. Now, there's another famous quote that I didn't find it, although it is in the Marine Corps Museum. And David, when you ever go back to Quantico, please go to the Marine Corps Museum, which is just a fantastic, south of DC, which is a fantastic place to see. And I challenge anybody who goes there, please go see. It is amazing what they've done with this Marine Corps Museum. In any case, one of the quotes is, and I'm gonna butcher this a little bit, but he's like, he reports back to the ship to Spruance, casualties, many. Forces under direct fire. Combat efficiency, we're winning. That was the kind of ethos that Colonel Shoup had on that day, and it was him personally pulling Marines up off that beach that you see is crowded on the left-hand picture and moving them forward and telling them to keep going that actually saves the first day of battle. Now, again, he's going to get a Medal of Honor for these 2 or 3 days of actions on the beach where he's wounded twice. But this is something the Marine Corps had not faced probably since the World War I, when they're walking across the wheat fields, if you remember my Bella Wood class, where it is just absolutely traumatic. And it's not like you see in the movies where it's like, follow me and throw a grenade and all of a sudden you're clearing things out. This is inching along the beach, but you have to push people forward. So by the first day, and I should start too with, by 6 o'clock in the morning, the U.S. Navy gunnery prep at the battlefield took out almost 40% of the casualties that were going to happen on the Japanese side. It was very effective, and it was very short. It was like from 6 to 9:30 in the morning. At 9 o'clock is when they were supposed to launch the invasion force of the Higgins boats and the LVTs, but it didn't start till 9:30. But 3.5 hours, they did a pretty good job in this very small area. I think later on it would lead to the Navy believing that prep of the battlefield was going to be, could be done pretty quickly, when in fact you needed days, if not weeks of preparation. And really, by this time, the Japanese, when you get to Iwo Jima, they're so far dug in, they know that they can weather the storm as far as bombing goes. But it was very effective this first day. Again, 40%, a little bit of aviation providing support as well and knocking out forces. But by the time the Marines soar ashore, the rear admiral is already killed. His staff is killed, and 40% of the folks are already dead on the Japanese side. So now it's just a fight to move forward. All right, next one, please. The forces advanced on that first day, a good 300 to 400 meters across, and in some instances in Red Beach, it's not an even line, but this is halfway across the island to the airfield that's in the middle of the place. But again, they're fighting with trenches and spider traps and holes and cross-firing positions. And the Japanese were very smart about hiding, letting forces go by, then popping up behind them and shooting them. So in any case, 21 November, the next day, they're moving beyond the initial beachheads and pushing inland against this suicidal resistance. The Japanese did not surrender. You'll see the final numbers at the end. It is unbelievable how the Japanese were just so fanatical and to a T did not respect anybody who surrendered. Matter of fact, they would try to kill themselves first, or kill themselves even after they surrendered, if they were caught, let's say. Shoup, like I told you, already twice wounded, personally moves troops over the beachheads. And so that picture that you see on the left is just Marines advancing over short, slowly, but consistently up across the battlefield here. And then you just have to root out these fanatical fighters. That's a flamethrower position on the right. They did land a couple of tanks. There was a Sherman tank and some Stuart tanks Some of the tanks sank immediately coming off the ships. Some of them were rendered immediately immobile by our counter fire. But the here actually some of the tanks actually did, and you didn't see that too often in some of the Marine campaigns later on. Again, because the rope, Iwo Jima was so difficult, and the tank's not going to go anywhere. Here it worked briefly and well enough, so it did help them in that sense. To this day, they actually cut across the island later on Green Beach on the western part of the island. If you look back at the map, there's a landing there. Artillery pieces are brought ashore, and they're starting to not only cut off the Japanese from each other, which is important because now they're losing line of communications, but they're starting to do, kind of corral them into pockets where they can individually take them out. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, we're almost to the end here as far as what happens here. You can just take a look at that colorized picture. The color came in a little bit later on, but that's a tank that the Japanese have hidden behind these logs, and it's almost impossible unless it is a perfect direct hit to take these things out. And so you can see that's a Marine that's of course on a captured tank, but I mean it's difficult. Now you would think a lot of the trees have been cleared by naval gunfire. It's amazing how many still stand, how many are taken out. But essentially the battle all day long at this particular point is consolidating the gains, isolating the Japanese, and pushing across the island. But the Japanese are still refusing to quit. Even kind of like the German stormtroopers in World War I, and to a certain extent too, they just understood how to do individual tactics. They weren't tied to a commander being there or not. They knew what they had to do as far as the mission goes, and of course, with their code of Bushido, this is what they would sacrifice themselves. So the bottom picture kind of shows Marines still slowly advancing across the battlefield despite all the and these are follow-on waves that are coming. But the Japanese on this particular night, the 22nd, launch at 7:30 in the evening a counterattack. It's not successful. They actually snuck onto some of the stranded Higgins boats that were in the lagoon and tried to launch attacks from there by surprising people. They were very wily and very good at sneaking around, but they couldn't get a concerted attack until the next slide. And this is where the Japanese earned their fierceness. Now people will tell you that bonsai attacks just don't work. But they are scary. And I would tell you, if you watch, the Pacific or some of these other shows or being on the receiving end of them, I'm sure they are blood curdling, and absolutely it is every person for themselves at that point, just fighting to make sure things don't happen. There's a large bonsai charge at 3:00 in the morning. Now, remember, the Japanese have almost lost the Kapit Island, and they could surrender. Most forces would, but of course, to their code, they're not going to. They would assemble their forces and they would just charge. Sometimes weapons empty, with swords, with flags, with bayonets. They did have some success. The first charge kills 45 Americans and wounds 128. But with the support from the Navy destroyers, they're calling in Navy gunfire at this particular point, sometimes within 100 feet or 200 feet within their range. And danger close for those kind of weaponry is usually somewhere between 600 to 800 feet. That's what we used to call it, when we were dropping bombs in the airplane. But you can call fire on your position if you want. The Marines killed 325 Japanese attackers. There's another attack that happens at 4:00 in the morning. This time they attacked 1st Battalion. 6 Marines had landed on the Green Beach. Roughly 300 Japanese troops come into the lines of A and B companies. And then, the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines with their 75 millimeter pack howitzers and also their artillery. They were able to beat back also with Navy gunfire, sometimes, again, within their own lines. At the end, 200 dead Japanese soldiers in the Marine front lines, another 125 behind their lines. And this is at night, dark. Maybe there's some flares, but there's a lot, there's whistles, there's sirens going off, there's Navy gunfire. Your lines are not exact. It's got to be absolutely terrifying. But when you only have 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers that are defending the island, and you're talking about several hundred dying at a time in attacks, you can see the numbers just don't equate. You're not going to win in the end. So Tarawa, at this particular point on the 23rd, by the end of the day, I think it was 1500, 3:00 in the afternoon, Tarawa belongs to the Marines. And then after that, it's just cleanup operations as they go to the other small islands that had some outposts and Japanese forces but they cleaned them up pretty quickly. Okay, next slide, please. So the aftermath. I put the statistics up here. I'm sorry, Japanese on the right. So 4,690 killed, only 17 soldiers captured, and 129 Korean laborers captured, 14 tanks destroyed. And you can see the toll that's exacted on the U.S. 109 killed, 3,000 total as far as casualties go. And then also U.S. Navy has people killed as well from gunnery fire. Only one officer and 16 enlisted men survived. 3,636 Japanese. I mean, this speaks to the absolute ferocity with the Japanese fought. And we know this is a common refrain, but it is something that the U.S. is going to have to deal with, and what led to eventually, right or wrong, the dropping of the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, because they just would not quit, nor would their personnel. And you've probably all heard the stories. Some of these islands, people, Japanese soldiers coming out after 30, 40 years going, okay, I finally quit. That kind of spirit and fighting spirit is something you just can't teach. It is brought up through generations of how you are developed over time. The 2nd Marine Division, you can read the numbers there as well. 1330 on the 23rd is when it ends up being. But anyway, this is going to lead to, I think, answering some of the questions here. This is a win. The Marines take stock in this, but when the news gets back to the States, people are absolutely appalled at the killing. I mean, these are World War I numbers in percentages, not in hundreds of thousands of lives lost. Already there's a lot of fighting, a lot of losing of lives, but just how can we have people just walk across kill zones like this and die? So the Marine generals and the Marine Corps and the Navy are going to be taking the task on this. They're going to adapt tactics later on. They're going to make things happen differently. But this was, at this particular point in the war, we had not, besides the initial, Dunkirk and all that kind of stuff, we had not had something like this with this percentage of killed. And these are the youth of America who've signed up, volunteered in many cases, besides even not even waiting to be drafted, and that are being killed at a rate that is not sustainable over time. So there are going to be adjustments to this afterwards. Next slide, please. So, the lore and legacy, there's actually, we actually have a Marine recruiter, believe it or not, that is stationed on this island and others, who still recruits locals this day to join the United States Marine Corps, because their generations remember this. And, there's a little postcard here that I had to the left. We still have generals and commandants and others that go back and celebrate, the history of Tarawa and everything that we learned. But you can see there some of the pictures of the pillboxes, the bunkers, the things that are left on the battlefield, the Higgins boats and other things that are rotting out there in the lagoon. This is very much a time capsule. If you go back, the island essentially looks like it did. More trees probably, but there is a lot of stuff and artillery, and there's a lot of stuff, military stuff and detritus that is left on the shores. We do have monuments and memorials. There are, I haven't been myself. I hope to be there one day. Robert Sherrod, who ended up writing a famous book about, said last week, and this particular, remember, this particular part of the war, Tarawa would stand along with famous battles like Bonhomme Richard, the Alamo, Little Bighorn, Belleau Wood at that time. Later on, there's going to be Iwo Jima, and other battles are going to just kind of make this a kind of a smaller show. But the Marines know that Tarawa is where it all started. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to wrap up here with, just to kind of show you some of the books. I've read 1 Square Mile of Hell and Utmost Savagery, The 3 Days of Okinawa. Galvanic, and some of these other tombs I'm sure are just as good. But I mean, this is something that has been studied, will be studied, and we still talk about it to this day. The Marine Corps has been fighting land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we're going back to our amphibious roots. And when we do, we go back to Plan Orange, which was the island hopping campaign made by Major Pete Ellis in the interwar period. We go back to the Banana Wars. We go back to our Pacific early roots to figure out how do we do things, what worked, what didn't work. So that's why Tarawa is very important. And I thank David and Laura for allowing me to speak about it finally again, from a perspective of history. And then last slide, please. And this will be my time for questions. Okay. Thank you. Hey,
Thank you very much for joining us on Voices of History. It's a real privilege for us to have you here to discuss these crucial episodes in our military history. And if you are agree, let's start with some questions to put this important event into the context and develop deeper into his historical and strategic significance. So let's start with the first question. David, si quieres, puedes empezar con esa primera pregunta también para contextualizar todo lo que vimos el día de hoy.
Perfecto, Laura. Ante todo, agradecer la interesante exposición que ha realizado el coronel Philippe D sobre la Operación Galvanic, el desembarco de los marines en Tarawa, en la cual hemos aprendido mucho más de esa espectacular operación anfibia llevada a cabo por los marines durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Una de las preguntas que tenemos es la siguiente. El desembarco de los marines en Tarawa, que fue parte de la Operación Galvanic, tuvo consecuencias significativas tanto en el ámbito militar como en el político. La batalla resultó ser una victoria estratégica para Estados Unidos, pero a un costo humano muy alto. ¿Crees que dicha batalla generó diversas controversias en la opinión pública y entre los mandos militares por la forma en la que se llevó a cabo y por las altas bajas sufridas en la batalla?
Yeah, hey David, I think I got most of that here, and just make sure I answered all the questions. But yes, and I think I covered this here. But happy to reiterate that yes, very strategic in the sense that this is the beginning of the island campaigns, but also very controversial. The number of forces, the number of casualties we took. This would not be sustainable over the long term. Guadalcanal was difficult enough as it is fighting the Japanese. But this was on another scale, even though it was just 3 days, really 4 days of fighting, to lose that many people, 30% of casualties on the first day for reasons that you could say, well, the tide wasn't in our favor, this happened, whatever the case may be, you still lost them. And, there's still a leadership question there. How can we continue to do this? How over time? So it was controversial back in the States. There was a public outcry. There was a question as to, what are we doing? Can we not do this better? But this was fundamental in changing our tactics, adapting to what the Japanese were doing, because that's the story of warfare. You do something, your adversary does something else, then you change your tactic, they change the tactics. And this goes back to warfare since the beginning. We will always, adapt our tactics, but so will they. So this will lead to further improvements as to how we attack later on, more sustained pre-gunnery fire, more sustained aviation, superiority, if not supremacy, more preparation of the battlefield. This leads to underwater demolition teams, the precursor to the SEALs. This leads to marine reconnaissance that will make sure the hydrography of the beach is what it says. We're not relying on some chart that's 50 years old. What we're relying on is the latest and greatest information that we can provide. Intelligence is very important to that. So I hope I answered the questions that were there, David. Yes, at that particular point, like we said, the largest invasion force put together up until that point in 1943. It was a win in the end, but there were failures along the way. It did cause some controversy. Those were addressed later on.
Thank you for your answer, Philip.
Thank you. And we continue with the next question, of course. David, seguimos con una siguiente pregunta también.
Sí. Dice así, ¿crees que la batalla de Tarawa fue una victoria estratégica, lo cual permitió a Estados Unidos el poder asegurar una base avanzada para futuras operaciones en el Pacífico Central, acortando la ruta hacia el Japón?
Yes. Just to make sure I get the subtlety of that, Laura or David, would you translate that one for me, please? Just to make sure I get it. Yeah.
Of course. Do you think that the Battle of Tarawa was a strategic victory, allowing the U.S. to secure a forward base in the future operation in the Central Pacific, shortening the route to the Japan?
Yes. No, thank you. I'm glad I asked for that, because I missed I would have missed something there. I can tell you this, is that one of the Marine generals, and I think it was Hal Matt Smith, if not Colin Smith, it might have another general named Smith, said, when he looked back later on, he said, should we have done this? He goes, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We could have, but we didn't know at the time. And, it was, some of this was, we just need to go step by step by step and figure it out. I think in hindsight, they looked back and said, we could have probably just done without that. But I think the importance of this, as difficult as it was losing, was understanding, at least it wasn't a 3-month campaign or a 3-week campaign. It was 3 days. And in those 3 days, utmost savagery, hell and 1 square mile, whatever the book said, this really taught us, like, hey, we got a big, and the Japanese are far from being defeated. We have a long route ahead of us. We need to adapt tactics. Did it save the day? I can tell you when we overtook Iwo Jima, it was important for the B-29 super fortresses that were bombing, later on in Japan and Okinawa, for planes coming back and landing. I can't remember a specific airplane coming back to Baitio and saying, thank God I had the airfield here. I would have never made it, because I think it was just so far out to the extremity of the the island chains. Did it help with the Marianas? You could argue yes, no. I think at that particular point, they were still looking for wins. They were still looking for something they could seize and say, we did it. It was painful to do so. So I think in the end, we probably could have just not done it. Nowadays, we certainly would absolutely just move past it and just let, aircraft bomb it or whatever the case may be. But that wasn't the thing back then.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We continue with the next question. David, seguimos con una siguiente pregunta también.
Sí, dice así: en Tarawa, y a pesar de las altas pérdidas, ¿crees que la campaña proporcionó valiosas lecciones sobre las operaciones anfibias y que serían cruciales para las siguientes batallas en el Pacífico?
Yeah, once again, just to make sure I get it right, Laura.
Okay. In Tarawa, despite the heavy losses, do you think that the campaign provided a valuable lesson about amphibious operation that would be crucial
Yes.
for the consequences battle in the Pacific?
No, thank you. And again, I just want to make sure I get these good questions down and I don't go over anything here or miss anything. The answer is absolutely yes. If there was a way to, and I hate to say this, if you could have a practice invasion under real circumstances, this was it. And it really showed, first of all, hydrography, which is something we don't necessarily think, but that's why we have SEAL teams. That's why we have force reconnaissance. Yes, they do cool things like, kill Osama bin Laden, but what they really do is they go scout out the beaches ahead of time, and they're not supposed to be discovered. And they understand how the tides are. They understand, where all the obstacles are, and they clear them beforehand. So this is where the underwater demolition teams that would become the SEALs later on really started earning their keep, to understand, okay, how do you attack and lessen the or take things out before we even have to shoot any, take a pillbox out, whatever the case may be. Also, the Higgins boats, yes, in principle, it was, hey, we're going to storm across these beaches, but you can see if they get stuck on the reefs and they're not going to make it in, then they're useless. Thank God we had light I always say this, we had landing vehicles tracked, which are what we have nowadays in the Marine Corps, AAVs, but they just retired. But now we have the advanced amphibious vehicles. These are the things that we're still practicing this day to get right. And they're always vulnerable to attack. I mean, they can only go so fast in a sea state, 4 or 5 knots, which is not very fast at all. But if you do it under cover darkness, you do it with the correct preparation of the battlefield, yes. So we learned that. And then we also learned that the Japanese were no longer going to let us come ashore. They were going to fight us all the way in and then keep fighting us. And if it hadn't been proven on Guadalcanal, they're not going to surrender. So I think we learned a lot from that. Also, maybe the missed mission or the misunderstanding of, hey, we did a short preparation of the battlefield, we knocked out 40%. This is not going to happen in the later campaigns and later islands. They are too heavily defended. Okinawa is big. Iwo Jima was big, and you can fire all day long for weeks on end and drop bombs. It's not going to make it that much easier. They will survive. I think there's a lot of lessons that we took away from that to say, okay, how do we apply this next? And also the controversy like that too, where you start losing people and people back home start saying, these are our sons and daughters. You're losing them at a too high a rate. What are you going to do about it? You have to adapt tactics.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer. We continue with the last question. David, seguimos con una última pregunta para continuar con nuestra programación.
Sí, la última pregunta dice así, a pesar de las críticas, la victoria en Tarawa, ¿crees que acabaría fortaleciendo la moral de los soldados norteamericanos, quienes vieron que la invencibilidad japonesa era un mito y que era posible vencerlos incluso en las islas más defendidas?
Yeah, I think I got that. What the critical or the aftermath, and how did it affect the United States, and again, Americans sending their sons and daughters, at that time sons, to go fight and die. Well, I mean, it comes back. It comes back to the public. You can only do so. And nowadays, as you know, the media is instantaneous. Back then, it would take a little bit of time for this to go back. But when you start seeing these kind of casualty numbers that are not sustainable, it is important that you address them and you tell the American public what you're going to do. This is one reason why Medal of Honor winners like John Basilone were recruited, and the Iwo Jima flag raisers were recruited to go back to the States and raise war bonds, and to also say, we do have heroes that have survived. We are doing the right thing. Yes, we've lost your brother and your son left on the left and the right, your father, whatever the case may be, but it is important. And that's, there is during any war, there's a strategic information campaign that needs to happen back into the United States. When I was fighting, and many others in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a time when all good, do what you got to do. You guys are all American heroes. But then after a while, it's like, what are we doing? Why are we losing so many? Why are there so many IED deaths? And you have to react. You can't. And then after 20 years, you can see where essentially the public opinion turned, where it's like, we're tired of wars. We're no longer, 911 is tomorrow. That is a significant event in American, if not world history. But you have people who are, I'm done. I don't want to see Americans deployed anymore. Okay, or allies deployed anymore. But if you don't, sooner or later, it's going to come back to you. So there's always a constant tension and balances to how do you address the public? How do you explain to them? And then what are you going to do about it? And it's the tough, shooting bullets is relatively easy. A strategic information campaign to win hearts and minds in the States or back home or wherever country, that is the most difficult thing that you can do. And it is very, very challenging. So I hope I answered that last question.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you very much.
Excellent answer. So, and Coronel Phillips, Professor David, thank you once again for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. It has been a real honor to journey with you through the significant episode in history, Operation Galvanic, the landing of the Marines at Tarawa. To everyone who joined us, thank you for being here and being part of this new space for Voices of History. We remind you that you can visit our website to learn more about upcoming events, conferences, and new installments of the International Interview Series. We'll see you again very soon in the next episode of the Voices of History. Thank you very much, and see you in the next international episode. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everything.